On the calendar today is another nomination. Today, the Senate's going to vote on the nomination of Chad Wolf. This is technically a vote for Mr. Wolf to be the Department of Homeland Security's Undersecretary for Policy. Let's be clear. This is actually a vote on whether Mr. Wolf should run the entire Department of Homeland Security. He would be the sixth secretary in charge of this critical agency, Department of Homeland Security, the sixth one since President Trump was elected. Talk about a fast-moving, revolving exit door. You can hardly get your desk put together and a few pens and computers on top of it, then you're out the door with President Trump if you're Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Well, next up, Chad Wolf. The President has indicated he's going to appoint him not as the Secretary of Homeland Security, no, the Acting Secretary of Homeland Security. But he first has to be confirmed as an Undersecretary. The Trump administration has shown in their immigration policy an approach to this issue that we haven't seen for decades in Washington or the United States. The president's been especially harsh when it comes to families and children. And President Trump's ineffective policies have made our southern border much less secure than when he took office. The situation has even been worsened by this gaping leadership vacuum at the Department of Homeland Security. In less than 3 years, 4 heads of the department. Wolf will be the 5th person to run. I said 6th earlier, sorry. 5th person to run it, and the 3rd acting secretary. Every position at Department of Homeland Security with responsibility for immigration is now held by a temporary appointee ready to be fired at a moment's notice. And the White House has not even submitted nominations for those petitions. This is a conscious choice by the Trump White House to increase their power and to undermine the role of the United States Senate, and the Republican majority thinks it's just fine. The president has boasted about all of his acting secretaries. He even has an acting chief of staff. Here's what he said: "I like acting," Donald Trump said. "It gives you great flexibility." It sure does. You can just fire a person and next up in a matter of days. Steve Vladeck, a leading expert on the Senate's confirmation process, notes that the president's approach is, quote, depriving the Senate of its constitutional role. And in the process of opportunities to vet his nominees, to reject those who are unqualified, and to conduct meaningful oversight of the executive branch. So what do the Senate institutionalists, like the senator from Kentucky, think about diminishing the roles of the Senate? Just fine, Mr. President, whatever you want. Today, the Senate will actually have a chance to vote on this individual, Chad Wolf, up to become an undersecretary, on his quick path to become an acting secretary, on his even quicker path to be, in some way, retired or fired. So is Chad Wolf the right person to run the Department of Homeland Security, one of the most important law enforcement agencies? Well, his main qualification appears to be that he was chief of staff and top advisor to former Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen. I would say that, arguably, she may have been one of the worst performing Homeland Security secretaries ever in our history. It was Kirstjen Nielsen who falsely claimed, and I quote, "We do not have a policy of separating families at the border," end of quote. And then came along a federal judge in Southern California and demanded an accounting of what actually was going on at the border. You know what he found, what the judge found? After he demanded the Department of Homeland Security under Kirstjen Nielsen account for family separations, they found that more than 2,800 infants, toddlers, and children had been separated from their parents at the border, and even worse, there was no effort made to trace where the parents were headed and where the child was headed. At the end, 100 of these children never, ever were reunited with their parents, separated by Kirstjen Nielsen's Department of Homeland Security. I've seen the result of these disastrous separations. Immigration court, downtown Chicago, a loop high-rise building. You'd never pick it out as a court. You take an elevator to one of the top floors, and get off to a crowded corridor, people standing 4 and 5 deep waiting for the docket call in an immigration court. I go into the court to see, just last year, to see what family separation was all about. I find a good judge who's been at it for almost 20 years, and she says to me, "Senator, please stay for the docket call, at least the first group of clients." Well, the first group of clients were called. Marta was one of the clients. The judge said, "Would the clients please take their seats?" The problem was Marta was 2 years old. Marta had to be lifted into her chair and handed a stuffed animal, which she was hanging on to throughout this hearing, which I'm sure she never understood. But Hamilton was the little boy who was also the client in the immigration court that day. He was 4 years old. 4 years old in a U.S. immigration court because of the separation of children from their parents. He did jump up on his chair because he saw a Matchbox car up on the table, which he could play with while this hearing was deciding his fate. You know what happened? They continued their cases for another 6 months. Fortunately, Marta was reunited with her mother in less than 6 months. Do you know what happened when they were reunited? Marta would not even let her mother hold her. That's what happens when you separate a 2-year-old from its mother for months at a time. And it's what happened over and over again on the watch of Kirstjen Nielsen, the Secretary of Homeland Security. And Mr. Chad Wolf, who's on our calendar today, was her chief of staff during this zero-tolerance policy. These disastrous separations have done permanent damage to countless children. I saw 2 of them. Publicly released emails show that Mr. Chad Wolf, who will be voted on today in the Senate, was deeply involved in the discussions that led to this policy. As far back as December of 2017, Wolf was acting chief of staff to Secretary Nielsen. He sent the Justice Department a list of 16 options for deterring undocumented immigrants. Number 2 on the list, quote, "separate family units," close quote. His fingerprints are all over zero tolerance. Mr. Wolf was also intimately involved in the Trump administration's efforts to use Dreamers as bargaining chips to advance the president's anti-immigrant agenda. After he repealed DACA, President Trump rejected numerous bipartisan deals to protect Dreamers. I won't go through the awful details of our bipartisan efforts to come up with a bill, which the president time and again rejected. Instead, he said, "Here's my approach to the Senate, take it or leave it." The Senate left it. It received fewer than 40 votes in a Senate dominated by a Republican majority. The administration said it would support legalization for Dreamers if the Congress passed his plan, which included the largest cut in legal immigration in almost a century. The Senate rejected it. How do I know that Mr. Wolf was involved in this effort? I sat in on half a dozen meetings with Secretary Nielsen and Mr. Wolf just down the hall from here, in the office of Republican Congressman Kevin McCarthy. He was there. Wolf was part of the program. In another administration, involvement in family separation and DACA would be grounds for dismissal. In the Trump administration's, it's grounds for promotion. Promotion to become the acting secretary and to see if this flavor of the month, as the head of one of these key agencies, can actually gut it out for 6 months. Might be a record if he did. I urge my colleagues to oppose the nomination of Mr. Wolf.